For weeks, the case of Tyler Robinson had unfolded in the relentless rhythm of the media. Reporters filled the seats every morning, cameras waited outside the courthouse doors, and the nation watched from screens, dissecting every motion, every legal update, every fleeting glance caught by a lens. But amid the noise, the commentary, the speculation, the arguments, there was one voice that had remained utterly silent: the voice of a mother. When she finally stood that morning, the courtroom did not simply quiet, it froze. There was something about her presence, small and trembling yet unshaken, that demanded attention in a way no gavel or order could. The microphone trembled as she adjusted it, her hands barely steady, her eyes searching for the courage to match the pain she carried. And then, in a voice more fragile than the still air around her, she began to speak. Her words didn't come from a place of defense. They came from grief, raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. She spoke of a son she once knew intimately, a boy who used to laugh in his sleep, who loved late-night cereal and soft music, who dreamed of building a life far from the noise that would one day define him. But as she spoke, that boy felt distant, as if swallowed by a version of himself even she could no longer recognize. Each word seemed to tremble under its own weight. She didn't cry. The tears had already been shed long before this moment, in the privacy of sleepless nights, in the helplessness of waiting for a call that never came. This was something else, something quieter. A mother's mourning for the child who was still alive but lost to a story she could no longer rewrite. The reporters who once typed rapidly stopped. The attorneys lowered their heads. Even the judge, usually composed and clinical, exhaled in the kind of stillness that said more than words could. For the first time, the case wasn't about law or evidence, it was about loss. She spoke about the silence before the tragedy, the moments that in hindsight looked like warnings, missed phone calls, the fading sound of laughter, the distance that grew one unanswered text at a time. "I used to think he just needed space," she said softly. "Now I know he was disappearing." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. Because her silence, that heavy, unbearable silence she had carried since the arrest, had become too loud to bear. The world had already judged her son, labeled him, dissected his every move. But no one had stopped to ask about the moments that led there, the quiet, invisible unraveling of a soul slipping through the cracks. Behind her words was not a plea for sympathy but a demand for understanding. For recognition that tragedy does not simply appear, it builds quietly in the places where compassion used to live. The courtroom, for a brief and fleeting moment, felt like a mirror. Everyone could see themselves in her: a parent, a sibling, a friend who once missed the signs, who once thought silence meant peace instead of pain. As she continued, her tone shifted from sorrow to reflection. "Maybe if I had listened closer, maybe if someone else had," she paused, the weight of her sentence hanging like smoke. "Maybe none of this would have happened." It wasn't accusation, it was regret. The kind that gnaws at you long after the lights go out. The kind that doesn't fade even when justice is served. By the time she finished, no one clapped, no one spoke. The air was thick with something unspoken, the understanding that her words had pierced deeper than any piece of evidence could. Her silence had broken, and in doing so, it broke something inside everyone listening. When she stepped back, the sound of the courtroom clock was the only thing that dared to move. Time, it seemed, had paused to honor her pain. And in that moment, the world realized that sometimes, the most powerful testimony isn't made by those seeking to win a case, it's made by those who have already lost everything. The air in the courtroom that morning carried a different weight, a kind that can't be described, only felt. When Tyler Robinson's mother finished speaking, something invisible shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, like the quiet tilt of a world that suddenly saw itself from a new angle. The judge sat motionless for a few seconds longer than usual, his eyes fixed on the mother who had just poured her soul into the room. The attorneys, once poised behind their arguments, lowered their notes. Even the sound of chairs creaking or papers shuffling seemed out of place now, too sharp, too careless for what had just unfolded. For weeks, this trial had felt mechanical. Every day began with procedure: evidence entered, objections raised, testimonies measured in precision and legality. But after her words, the courtroom felt human again. The walls that usually divided sides, prosecution versus defense, guilt versus innocence, blurred into something more fragile, more painfully real. The prosecutor, a man known for his composure, glanced toward the defense table and then back at his own notes. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, not out of uncertainty but out of respect. "Your Honor," he began, "we may proceed with the next witness." Yet even as he said it, his tone betrayed a shift. The fight for a verdict suddenly felt smaller than the truth that had just filled the room. People in the gallery, reporters, spectators, even the court officers, sat in reflective silence. Some wiped their eyes quietly, others simply stared ahead, trying to process what they had heard. It wasn't pity that moved them, it was recognition. Because grief, when spoken honestly, strips away every layer of distance. The judge leaned back in his chair, his voice calm but heavy. "Let us take a brief recess," he said. It wasn't routine, it was mercy. He, too, needed a moment to breathe. Outside in the hallway, the usual buzz of discussion was absent. Cameras that once flashed relentlessly now hung still. Reporters exchanged glances, hesitant to break the quiet. One whispered to another, that wasn't testimony, that was truth. When court resumed 30 minutes later, the atmosphere remained subdued. Every word felt slower, more deliberate, as if everyone had learned the cost of speaking without feeling. The next witness approached the stand, but even he seemed different, his tone cautious, his sentences weighed. It was as though the mother's words had left an imprint on the floor itself. During cross-examination, the defense attorney, a man often accused of cold precision, paused mid-sentence. His eyes drifted toward Tyler, seated behind the glass. For the first time, the defendant didn't look like a headline or a case number. He looked like a person, broken, confused, and painfully aware of what his mother had just carried for him. Tyler's face was unreadable, but his eyes glistened. Whether it was guilt, sorrow, or disbelief, no one could tell. But for a fleeting second, he looked less like an accused man and more like a lost one, someone trapped between the weight of his actions and the echo of his mother's love. Even the bailiff, usually stoic and detached, shifted uneasily. The silence that followed every sentence grew longer, heavier. It wasn't awkward, it was reverent. Everyone seemed afraid to disturb what had settled over the room, a shared awareness that this case was no longer just about law, it was about people and the invisible fractures that lead to tragedy. One witness would later describe it as the moment the courtroom stopped being a battlefield and became a mirror. Because that's what it was, a reflection of everything society overlooks until it's too late. The trial wasn't just about who pulled a trigger or who lost a life. It was about the long, slow chain of moments that built toward both. As proceedings continued, the judge's voice carried a new tone, not of authority but empathy. The prosecutor's arguments softened, the defense grew quieter. Even the reporters' summaries that day were different, less sensational, more human. They wrote not about drama but about understanding. And somewhere in the back row, a woman who had come to observe, a teacher perhaps or a social worker, wiped her eyes and whispered, "That could have been one of my students." That was the turning point. Not the presentation of evidence, not a confession, not a verdict, but a collective realization that beneath every tragedy are warnings, missed chances, and people too busy or too blind to see them. When the session adjourned for the day, no one rushed to the exits. The mother remained seated for a while, her gaze fixed on the empty witness stand. Maybe she was replaying her own words, or maybe she was just trying to breathe in a room that now carried the echo of her truth. As she finally rose to leave, even the bailiff, a man of few words, nodded slightly, almost in salute. It wasn't protocol, it was respect. And as the doors closed behind her, the room exhaled a truth that would linger for the rest of the trial. Justice might determine guilt, but only empathy can reveal what it costs. When the court reconvened that afternoon, the atmosphere felt heavy, subdued, as if the walls themselves remembered the morning's heartbreak. But what no one could ignore anymore was that this case, beneath all the filings and motions, was no longer just about crime or guilt. It was about two families, both shattered in different ways, both trapped inside a story that neither asked for. On one side sat the Kirk family, eyes tired from grief, hands clasped tightly together. Their son Charlie was gone, a name now spoken in past tense, his life reduced to exhibits and timelines. Every time the prosecution mentioned his name, his mother's shoulders tensed as if each repetition reopened a wound that never healed. She had learned to sit still, but inside, the storm never stopped. On the other side of the room, Tyler Robinson sat behind the glass, his face pale, still unreadable. And behind him, his mother, the woman who had silenced the entire courtroom with her trembling voice, stared straight ahead. Between the two mothers hung a silence so profound it felt sacred. They had nothing in common, and yet they shared everything. Both had loved, both had lost, and both were now spectators to a system trying to make sense of what could never truly be mended. As the afternoon session began, the defense attorney stood to deliver a statement. His voice was calm, deliberate, but unlike before, it wasn't layered with strategy, it carried sorrow. "No verdict," he said slowly, "can restore what's been broken here, and no punishment can ease the pain of either family." His words weren't meant for the judge, they were meant for the room, for the cameras, the spectators, and for history itself. He paused, glancing briefly at Tyler's mother. "This is not a story of innocence or guilt alone," he continued. It's a story about loss multiplied. The judge said nothing, neither did the prosecutor. There was nothing to argue, because at that moment it became clear that both families had already paid a price far greater than any sentence could impose. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was quieter than usual. Reporters gathered in hushed tones, microphones lowered. The story was no longer sensational, it had become solemn. Even the headlines that night changed tone. A mother's voice brings humanity to the courtroom. Two families, one unimaginable loss. For once, the public wasn't divided into sides, not fully. Online discussions filled with words like heartbreaking, understand, forgiveness. People who had never met either family found themselves reflecting on their own, on the people they might have overlooked, the silences they might have ignored. In the courtroom the next day, the Kirk family was given space to speak. Charlie's father stepped forward, his voice shaking with quiet fury and unbearable sadness. "My son will never walk through our door again," he said, each word deliberate, heavy. "No sentence will bring him back, but I pray that no other parent has to stand where we stand." Then he looked, for the briefest second, toward Tyler's mother, not with hatred but with the weary understanding of someone who recognized pain when he saw it mirrored. She lowered her gaze, a single tear tracing her cheek. That moment, that brief, fragile connection between two broken parents silenced the room again. It was not reconciliation. It was something more subtle, recognition. The acknowledgement that in every tragedy, pain travels in two directions. Afterward, as people exited the courtroom, whispers followed like a slow tide. Some said the case had shifted forever, that this wasn't just about a crime but a reflection of a culture that doesn't notice people until after they've fallen apart. Tyler's mother stood outside by the courthouse steps, her face hidden behind dark glasses. A reporter approached gently and asked, "Do you have anything more to say?" She hesitated, her lips trembling. "No," she said quietly. "I've already said everything that matters. The rest is for God and for people to understand before it happens again." Later that evening, both families went home to empty rooms. One to a silence that came from absence, the other to a silence that came from shame. And though they would never speak directly, both would carry the same unspoken question: how did it come to this? In homes across the country, people watched the coverage and sat in their own reflections. Some blamed, some prayed, but beneath the noise was a quieter realization that tragedy doesn't end when the trial does. It lingers, breathing through those left behind, teaching hard lessons in whispers rather than verdicts. Because justice, as the courtroom proved that day, doesn't always heal. Sometimes it only reveals how deep the wounds really go. And as the screen fades to black, the narration might say, in the end, two families walked away from the same courtroom, both grieving different versions of the same loss, one life gone, another forever changed. And somewhere between them lies the truth that justice can measure guilt but never the cost of a broken heart. After the verdict was read, after the cameras packed away and the headlines began to fade into yesterday's news cycle, something strange happened. Silence. Not the kind that comes from peace, but the kind that comes when the world moves on, leaving behind the people who can't. For most, the Tyler Robinson case became another story in a sea of tragedies. Something to scroll past, something to discuss briefly before dinner. But for those who truly listened, to the mother's trembling words, to the judge's exhausted eyes, to the unspoken ache between two families, it was more than a courtroom drama. It was a warning. Because somewhere along the way, society had forgotten how to listen. The signs had been there: the disconnection, the isolation, the quiet desperation masked by smiles and routine. Tyler's silence wasn't just his own. It was a reflection of a generation drowning in noise but starving for understanding. A world that glorifies success, image, and strength, but rarely teaches people how to ask for help without shame. As the days passed, a few journalists tried to dig deeper. They spoke with classmates, neighbors, teachers, anyone who had once known him. "He was quiet," they said, "always polite, kept to himself." Phrases that sound harmless until they echo like warnings too late to be heard. In a small town that now felt emptier, one teacher reflected on a memory: Tyler staying behind after class, staring out the window for too long. She remembered asking if he was okay and his faint smile as he said, "Just tired." She didn't press further. And years later, that memory haunted her, not because she didn't care, but because she thought silence meant strength, not pain. The tragedy revealed something more uncomfortable than guilt. It revealed neglect, the quiet kind that doesn't make headlines, the neglect of listening, the neglect of noticing, the neglect of the small human signals that someone is slipping through the cracks. And beyond that courtroom, across countless homes and schools and offices, millions saw themselves reflected in that story, in the missed calls, the unspoken check-ins, the "he's fine" that end up being the last thing ever said. Society loves to analyze the aftermath, the crime, the verdict, the punishment, but almost no one talks about the before, about the invisible breaking that happens long before anyone picks up a weapon or loses control. That is where the real story lives, not in the violence itself, but in the silence that came before it. When the documentary cameras returned weeks later to capture the closing chapter, they found Tyler's mother sitting alone on her porch. No makeup, no press, just a small framed photo of her son before the world knew his name. She didn't talk about the trial, she talked about the world. "How many more mothers have to whisper to their children through glass before someone listens?" she asked softly. "How many signs do we keep missing because we're all too busy pretending we're okay?" Her words didn't make the final cut of the TV segment. They were too quiet, too uncomfortable, too real. But they lingered, in the few who were there, in the sound operator who turned away to hide his tears, in the journalist who later admitted that moment changed how she saw every stranger she met. And perhaps that's the legacy of this story, not the verdict, not the tragedy, but the mirror it held up to all of us. Because every society wants to believe that evil is distant, that it comes from monsters, not from people who look like us. But the truth is harder. The truth is that sometimes the people who break were once the ones begging silently to be seen. The story of Tyler Robinson will fade from trending lists, but it will remain a quiet reminder of what happens when silence goes unnoticed. A story told in 4 acts: grief, confrontation, reflection, and finally, realization. In the closing narration, a voice might say, "The world didn't need another headline, it needed a lesson. The lesson that silence speaks, and it speaks loudly. That before every tragedy there are whispers, and if we learn to listen, maybe one day we won't have to mourn what we could have saved." The rain stops, the sky lightens faintly, not with joy but with understanding. And as the screen fades to black, the final words appear in silence. Listen before it's too late.